Hello again. So let's pick up where we left off. And where we left off is we're talking about your library corner. Picture concept books are appropriate for very young children, but don't overlook these for even the older ones. Sometimes they need to see a picture concept instead of a lot of writing. We just assume that because they're older, they don't want to look at this stuff. Lady I used to teach with, who taught sixth, seventh, and eighth grade language arts, in seventh grade had her seventh graders do picture book reviews. She'd come up to my classroom and get a bunch of picture books for the kids to look at and review, and they loved that. Don't underestimate the power of picture books with even the older ones. Traditional literature, nursery rhymes, fairy tales, familiar stories. One of the tragedies that happens now is too many of your children come to school with no knowledge or very little knowledge of the familiar nursery rhymes. Therefore, they struggle with reading sometimes because they don't have that beginning phonemic awareness skill of hearing rhyme. They need to be able to do that. Teaching nursery rhymes. I had a class one time in second grade, and we had to go back and we had to learn some of the familiar nursery rhymes because I had too many of them that could not hear rhyme, the RHYME, where you hear the rhyme. Fairy tales, I also did a unit on fairy tales, just because the kids thought they were fun, and you can do so many things with fairy tales. Realistic literature is a category within picture books that deals with real life problems. This is important because this gets into the expository text business again. You teach social studies this way, or history this way, science. It's realistic literature that you're using when you're teaching those content classes. Then you can use in those that issues that kids are going to face. Don't be afraid to have books, not that you're going to showcase them necessarily, but about divorce, about um, sibling rivalry, about bullying, those kinds of things. Bedtime Fears, A Nightmare in My Closet. Mercer Mayer's A Nightmare in My Closet. A new baby that comes into the family. I remember several kids when I was teaching, even at fifth grade, when I was teaching fifth grade, some of them wouldn't have a new baby, but it was more often in second grade, first grade, and they were sometimes the only child to that point, and it was a real tussle because now there's a new baby in the house, and mom doesn't have all her time for this one, and she's always with the baby. And don't be afraid to talk about those kinds of things, but be sensitive. We had if sometimes you have to talk about death even with little ones. There are some really good books about that. I had a little girl in second grade that her father passed away from cancer, and you're going to have that sometimes, and it's an unavoidable fact of life, but they don't know how to compartmentalize those feelings. So doing it with picture books is a good way to touch base with them without getting into a lot of detail, but letting them know that you understand that they're going through a tough time. Teachers should use discretion, which is what I just said when you're reading to the whole class. Sometimes you just need to take a couple of kids aside. If you know they're all dealing with the same issue, or there's a problem going on, and you have a group of kids that are involved in this similar problem, take those few aside and work with them. You don't need to involve the whole class. Wordless books, I talked about that with the red book. There are lots of wordless picture books now that have a definite story within the pictures, but there are no words. The kids can write their own story. There's a definite sequence to the story. There's a definite story there, but you're going to have let your kids use their creativity and come up with some things with those kinds of books. The they're good for kids who are 5 years and older. You have some kids even younger than that, though, that have been read to a lot, have a lot of stuff going on, and they can put stories to those. Poetry is a lot of times forgotten in children's literature. Poetry is an important part of a literacy center and it needs to be taught. Even at a young age, they need to hear the poetry, and you need to have at that point poetry that rhymes because that it just reinforces that rhyme. Novels or longer books with chapters. Don't overlook little novels for beginning readers, even if they're very short. I used to read kind of novels, I guess, with my second graders, even first graders. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, um, Charlotte's Web, Stuart Little. They love those books. They just can't wait to hear the next chapter. They love those books. They can't necessarily read them themselves, but it exposes them to more, it's a higher level vocabulary, a broader storyline. They love that stuff. Biography is a genre appropriate for young children, but you need to get biographies to which they can relate. Baseball players, basketball players, sports figures, the presidents, those kinds of things as you're talking. Throw in biographies, which of course are expository text. And leveled books can be in a literacy center, but I would use those a little with, they're okay, but there's so much other actual solid literature out there to use than those, that I would reserve those for reading time myself, but that's just me. Levels are determined by different words, and we just talked about that. But even here in this description, you'll notice that content is never suggested. Non-traditional books, joke books, riddle books, craft books, graphic novels, comic books, cookbooks, whatever. Books in a series built around a single character. If you use those kinds of books, be sure that you're influencing them with other material, not just a single author or a single book with a singular group of characters. They need to read widely. They need experience across genres, across authors. Use menus, directions, maps. Get a map of the zoo, get a map of the science center, of the town they live in, whatever. Take them out on a walk. Where are you going? What direction are you going? Whatever. Those kinds of things are important as well. They enjoy literature that is predictable because it helps them understand the story. So predictable books are great. It also helps them read along, or they can then echo read because they know what's coming up next. They can anticipate a little bit. You're going to throw in there some manipulatives, little letters, magnetic letters. Perhaps use cookie sheets with magnetic letters, with rhymes, with in RHYME, and also RIME rhymes, digraphs, longshore bells, whatever. Throw that stuff in there into the literacy center. Make it fun. Don't make it a chore. Take them out on a phonics walk. Headsets with audio stories, we've talked about a little bit. Especially helpful with English language learners, those audio stories. Have them follow along in the text. If they're struggling, if they're an English language learner, that will help them, especially listening to a fluent reader, following along with the text, hearing the words and seeing and hearing the words as well as seeing the print, and putting those two things together. When you're using this stuff, you also need to add writing in your literacy centers. You need to balance your literacy with reading as well as writing. The literacy centers are intended for students to be self-directed. They make decisions, but you have to lead them. And they you can do this or you can do this, whatever you choose, but this is what has to happen. If you go this way, you're going to end up with this. If you go this way, you're going to end up with this. So whichever way you want to go, but this is what it needs to look like. Most activities are done in groups of 2 or 3 and involve peer cooperation or peer tutoring, which brings us to another piece here, is the grouping in your centers. You have to know your kids. You need to know who works well with whom, and who is not just going to walk in and take it over, and who is not going to sit back and let them do it. So you're going to have to be careful with your grouping and have them grouped accordingly. When children take charge of their learning and demonstrate the use of oral reading, silent reading, writing, and demonstrate their comprehension and inferential discussions. Now, go back to the silent reading piece here. I think we've talked about this before, but I just want to be sure. Especially first grade and maybe about halfway into second grade, they can't read silently because the little voice in your head that reads with you isn't developed yet. You have to have that little voice in your head to read silently. They are going to mumble. It's going to be a low rumble when you're asking them to read silently. And maybe you have, I distinctly remember, and I'm sure I did it myself, that when I was a kid, I can remember sitting in school and the teacher said, walking around and say, shh, read to yourself, read to yourself. They can't. They cannot read to themselves yet. So you have to give them a little bit of leeway there, hand them a whisper phone, if nothing else. Literacy center activities expose these children to reading and writing in lots of forms and give them opportunities to make choices. They get a much more positive feel for literacy if they're given choices and if they are successful. You have to lead them to the point that they are going to be successful no matter what level they are. They can be successful. If you have a child at the top, you're going to have to push them. If you have a child at the bottom, you're going to have to pull them up, but you're not going to pull them up so far that you jerk their pants off. You're going to pull them up so that they can be successful and then scaffold the instruction for them, modeling all the way so they can be successful. When the teacher plays an influential role because you need to be their biggest advocate. You need to be their coach. You need to be their biggest fan. You need to be the one who is working with them and telling them they're doing a good job. You got this. No worries. You got this. One of the clear points to emerge from research into reading failure is that there is no association between reading and pleasure. You must teach your students that you can read just for the reading's sake. You can read for pleasure. You don't have to test them every single time they read something. That is a huge mistake. It's made all the time, every day, in every school. You don't have to test them on everything they read. The role of teachers in stimulating voluntary reading among children and young people is potentially the most powerful of all adult influences upon the young. If you ask students, and this has been researched year after year after year after year, research tells us over and over and over and over again, the most influential, the most important, the most useful thing in a classroom to children when they are asked is not the book, it's not the smart board, it's not the Promethean board, it's not the literacy centers, it's the teacher. You are filling that role and you have to, those are big shoes you're going to have to fill. Programs that incorporate pleasurable literacy experiences create interest in and enthusiasm for books. I'm telling you, if you will pick a book off your reading shelf and read it, you will be amazed. It may be a book that nobody's ever looked at. It will be passed around the classroom, I guarantee it. At least around with the better readers. Sometimes it'll even get to the less able readers because you've already read it. They know what it means, they know what it's about, and they loved it. And it may have sat on your shelf for a year. Nobody looked at it. You get it, pick it up and read it as a read aloud, they're going to follow suit. Somebody's going to want it as soon as you're done. I want that book. I want that book. I want that book. You're going to have them eaten out of your hand. If they're interested in something, it heightens that when the stories are discussed both before and after you're reading it. You activate the background knowledge. You talk to them about it. What do you know about this? How can you do this? What can you do? Especially if they're related to issues that reflect children's real life experiences or current school topics. What's going on? Let's talk about it. We're going to talk about that in the next video because I'm up against the clock. So I will talk to you in after a while.